All right, guys, this one's about files. Now, again, this is a new topic for most of you. Now, files is a very important part of programming. Using files actually helps us do things that we couldn't do previously with our knowledge in programming. Files are used to essentially permanently store things, even if the program has stopped executing. Up to now, you were using arrays and variables to store values, but the moment that the program stopped executing, all of those values would disappear. Whereas with a file, all of those values will remain in the file even after the program has stopped executing. Now, the cool thing is that we can continue using the same file to add more things to it the next time we execute the program. Now, before we get to the nitty-gritty parts of files, you need to understand a few things. Now, files have three main operation modes. One mode for reading. So essentially, if I'm using this operation mode, I can only view the things on the file. Okay. Another operation called write, which goes without saying, it's for me to add things to a file. And another operation mode, which is append, which means if my file already has data inside it, and I want to continue adding more data to that file, I need to use the append. If I have a file that contains data and I use the operation mode write, it means that anything new I write to the file will remove the previous content and replace it with the new lines that I want to add to it. Okay, so if we are using append, it's to add things to a file that already contains data. If we are using write, it's for me to essentially start from scratch, fill in a new empty file. Okay, now another important piece of information. Files work with lines, okay? So you can write one line after another in a file, okay? And we'll see what statement we have to use to do this. And also, anything that we write to a file or anything that we read from a file is of data type string. In other words, if I want to write a bunch of numbers in my file, those numbers, before they're written into my file, they have to be converted from an integer to a string. Okay? Or if I want to do the opposite, if I have a bunch of numbers written in my file and I want to extract those numbers and perform a calculation with them, it means that after I've extracted those values, I will have to convert them into an integer. Now, how do we do this? Well, if you've watched any of the previous videos, you'll know that there's functions such as string to num or num to string that can convert these values. Okay, now, how do we use files? How do I actually write a program that will allow me to use a file? Well, first of all, you need to know what the file name is called. Okay, and before you use it, you need to type in this statement here, open file, followed by the name of the file in quotes, okay? And if provided, this is not always provided, if provided, write the extension as well. Once I've written the file identifier and its extension, then I need to say for, and I need to mention which operation mode I will be using. In this situation, I said open the grades.txt file, and I'll be reading from it. I don't want to add any data to it. I just want to read whatever's inside. Okay? And once I'm finished using the file, I need to remember to write close file, followed again by its identifier. In your examination, you will not be rewarded a point if you type this in and forget to type this in. Okay, so when you open a file, remember when you're done to close it. Otherwise, you will not be awarded a point. Okay, now let's get to something a bit more interesting. Right, here's an example. A teacher wants to write 10 test grades into a file called grades.txt. Right. We'll take for granted that we are asking the teacher to enter 10 test grades, okay? That the teacher's the one that's going to be giving these test grades and putting them into our file. So here's a little strategy. To write to the file, we need to use something called a write file command, which we haven't seen yet and we'll talk about in just a moment. Okay? The command, when written, can write one line of data to the file every time it's called. So every time you see this write file, it's the equivalent of saying, okay, I'm going to write something new on this new line. Okay? Right. And then here in my strategy, since we know that we have 10 grades, the write file command will need to be written or repeated 10 times. Okay? And since we know the exact amount of repetitions, a for loop is ideal in this situation. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the code here and let's explain. Okay. I'm going to ignore this for just a moment until we get to the write file command, and we'll get back to it in just a moment. Now, here I've created a variable called grade, and it's of data type integer, and it's for the teacher to essentially type in her grade, and we'll have it saved somewhere. Okay, once I've done that, I'm going to open my grades file, which I'm considering in this situation is empty because I've selected the for write operation. Okay, now if the grades.txt file isn't empty and I'm opening it for write, anything new I write in it will replace everything that existed in before it. So for the sake of the example, let's imagine that the grades.txt file right now is completely empty. Now, since I want the teacher to type in 10 grades, I'm using a for loop and I'm asking the teacher, please enter a test grade, and every time the teacher inputs the grade number, it's saved in a variable called grade. Okay. Now, notice that grade is an integer. And if you remember from what we said before, we cannot write integers into a file. So that means that we have to use, okay, a function that will convert our grade, okay, from an integer into a string. Okay, I'm going to remove some of this because I don't want it to be complex. Here we go. So I'm using this line of text variable here, which we didn't talk about before, okay, to save whatever the grade the teacher entered, but in a string format. So if the teacher entered, for example, 67 here, okay, this will convert 67 to this 67, a string, like so. Now, here's the important part. I'm going to use that write file command that we mentioned just a moment ago. And in order to use this write file command, we need to do what we did before. So mention which file we're going to write to, okay? And then followed by a little comma and the variable. Now, this doesn't have to be a variable. This can be any string value. Now, in this situation, line of text will contain my grade in string format. So essentially, this is saying put into the grades.txt file the string value of 67 in the first line that you find. So if I have, let's say, my file, here it is, okay? This write file command will come to the first line and put the value 67 right here. Okay, now the loop will repeat. Okay, the teacher can enter a different test grade. Let's say that she enters, I don't know, 88. Okay, and then 88 will be converted to the string 88 with the string to num function. And then when this line of code is executed, this means that it will go and find the grades file. Here it is. Okay, find an empty line or the next available empty line. Okay, and place inside it whatever the value of line of text is, which in this case is currently 88. And this will continue until the teacher essentially inserts 10 grades. Once the for loop is finished, we need to remember to close the file and we are done. Okay, so the important thing to grasp here is this line of code right here. Okay, we need to write the identifier and then followed by a variable which will contain something that is of string data type. Awesome. Right. I hope this video was helpful. I'll catch you in the next one for a read file.